Well, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and if you look at the roster of people who have given this lecture, it's quite a distinguished group, and I hope not to drag them down today. I want to thank Steve Anderson and Jamie and the whole Forest History Society staff, the Nicholas School, Dan Richter, who actually contributed in substantive ways to this book, and of course the Lynn Day Endowment that makes this lecture possible. The Forest History Society has a lovely piece on their website about Lynn Day, which I'd never known much about her, so I did a little research, and I would suggest you all go take a look at it. Well, let's get right to it here. By the 1930s, the American South was a theater of environmental disasters, to borrow a phrase from the historian Albert Cowdery. And my new book examines one dimension of that story, the extreme human-induced soil erosion that racked the region and created the impetus for modern soil conservation. Now, I examine that larger history through the unlikely history of a place called Providence Canyon. I don't know, has anyone heard of or been to Providence Canyon? A couple of people. I'm not surprised. I'm actually surprised more that a couple have heard of this place. It's also known as Georgia's Little Grand Canyon, and today, despite a few occasional claims to fame like this, almost no one has heard of the place. It's visually stunning, worth a visit for the scenery alone, but it is also perhaps the largest anthropogenic erosion gully in the United States, if not in the entire world. It dates to the middle of the 19th century, and it was allegedly caused by poor farming practices. Now, my book centers on the history of this place, and particularly on a contest in the 1930s between locals who wanted to get it preserved as a national park and insisted that it was natural. You laugh. And a group of national soil conservationists and environmental reformers who saw it as, I call it the poster child of Southern soil abuse. Look what Southerners have done to their land. I argue that actually neither group was quite right in how they interpreted the place. Indeed, I came to understand that my initial sense of irony, the irony with which I greeted this place, your laughter, that there was a park that protects and celebrates the scenic results of an environmental disaster, actually did the place and its history a disservice. But you'll have to read the book to find out all of that. Today's lecture is not about Providence Canyon, at least directly. Instead, it's about a series of questions that writing this book led me to ask about other Southern landscapes of conservation. In particular, it's about the ecology and politics of environmental forgetting in a region that over the course of a human lifetime has again experienced a stunning metamorphosis, this one defined largely by afforestation and urbanization. There are certainly things to be celebrated in the profound environmental transformation that has come over the South in the last 3/4 of a century. What the distinguished Southern historian and one of the earliest Duke PhDs in history, another little tidbit that I learned, Thomas D. Clark, more than 30 years ago, called the greening of the South. As I'll point out later in my talk, there's a whole conservation landscape that emerged from this process. But instead of celebrating this greening as an environmental triumph, I want to plumb the tensions between restoration, environmental restoration, and historical amnesia, what I call the ecology of erasure. I'll examine how trees have helped us to forget and how conservation areas, seen for what they actually are, might allow us to better remember an important chapter in Southern environmental history when erosion was both a disastrous environmental reality and a powerful metaphor for social disintegration in the region. This is actually at Providence Canyon. It's one of my favorite sites. And there's even this helpful sign that helps you interpret it. These cars are apparently now unique ecosystems. It in fact reminds me of one of my favorite Onion headlines, "Old Abandoned Dryer by Train Tracks, now a vital part of ecosystem." So let me take you to a few places in the South. The Onion, like they must employ an ecologist or something. They really get it right. So let me take you to a few places that I came to know as a result of this research. And I want to start at the Alcovy Conservation Center, which is due east of Atlanta. It's the headquarters of the Georgia Wildlife Federation. And it's surrounded by what they have described as, quote, 115 acres of pristine forest, meadow, and river swamp, end quote. Now, the environmental showpiece of this property is a Tupelo gum swamp, pictured here without the water in its leafless autumn state, which is at the confluence of the Alcovy River and Cornish Creek. Such a swamp is a rare thing to find in the Piedmont. And this swamp and thousands of additional acres of swamplands along this river, not surprisingly, were at the center of a classic post-war environmental battle. In the 1960s, the Soil Conservation Service embarked on a program that they called stream channelization. And the idea was to channelize small rivers and streams to improve them, to drain and prevent flooding of valuable agricultural lands by straightening, widening, removing obstructions from these small rivers and creeks, as well as draining swampy riparian areas and clearing banks of vegetation. You can't read that very well, but the little tagline is, "You can't catch fishes in SCS ditches." And that was true. All right. Like so many federal programs launched in the name of conservation during the immediate interwar years, stream channelization was a bad idea. From an economic standpoint, the program spent considerable taxpayer money to bring small amounts of land into production at the very moment when federal agricultural policy was mostly about taking land out of production. Right? And so it benefited few farmers, and it did considerable ecological damage. This was particularly true for the Southeast, which played host to a remarkable 70% of these channelization projects. As a result of the habitat destruction both caused and threatened by these ill-conceived projects, many Southeastern fish and game agencies, private conservation organizations like the Georgia Wildlife Federation, and even citizens organized in protest. In the process, they crafted a series of innovative arguments for the preservation of watery ecosystems that not only encouraged many to value swamps, which had long been derided as useless environments in need of improvement, but they also argued for what we would today call ecosystem services. It's no exaggeration to say that stream channelization helped to produce an environmentalist sensibility in the American Southeast. One of the projects that the Soil Conservation Service proposed was the improvement of more than 70 miles of the Alcovy River. They wanted to turn it into a ditch like this. Quickly, a group of state officials in Georgia and private citizens came together to oppose the plan. Activists highlighted the Alcovy's threatened river swamps and their many recreational, ecological, and economic benefits, and they argued that the river produced more value left alone than it would if it was channelized and allowed agricultural land to be developed. And and all of this happened in the Earth Day year of 1970. All right. Now, the great champion of the Alcovy cause was Charles H. Wharton, pictured here, an ecologist at Georgia State University who wrote passionately about the value of river swamps, particularly in his 1970 publication, The Southern River Swamp, a Multiple-Use Environment. Wharton's study, which came as a direct response to the proposal to channelize the Alcovy River, presented a multifaceted case for appreciating river swamps as green belts and wildlife corridors and wetlands that stored water and purified runoff, and recreationally and educationally vital wild open spaces in a rapidly urbanizing region. All right? And critical to Wharton's logic to its preservation was his insistence on the river swamp's deep temporal naturalness. Quote, "Most swamps are probably thousands of years old," he speculated. But here's the rub. Not everyone agreed with Wharton's depiction. A geographer by the name of Stanley Trimble had just completed an MA thesis at the University of Georgia in 1969 on the Oconee River and was beginning an influential dissertation on the history of Piedmont soil erosion. Though no friend of stream channelization, he offered a very different interpretation of the Alcovy River swamps. Trimble's MA thesis, which had focused on the Oconee River to the east of the Alcovy watershed, had found that most swampy lands there had resulted from culturally accelerated sedimentation produced by upland soil erosion. Right? As I detail in my book, river bottoms throughout the South were inundated by huge amounts of erosional debris during the plantation era, a process that often resulted in the creation of swampy conditions, or what soil surveyors euphemistically called meadows. And I can talk about that more later. It's a very interesting term. Trimble suspected that the Alcovy River swamps had similar origins, and so he did a quick study whose results were also published in 1970. To determine the age of the swamps, Trimble relied mostly on historical archival sources. He began with pre-settlement surveys produced by the Office of the Surveyor General in Georgia. And while those surveys documented a few swampy areas along the river, they were nothing compared with the extent of the swamps by the 1970s. And there was no sign of a swamp at the confluence of the Alcovy River and Cornish Creek, where the Georgia Wildlife Federation swamp sits today. Trimble also looked at land sale records, and he found that these bottomland areas, which are now swampy, were highly valued back in the day. People had bought them and sold them at a premium in the antebellum era, and settlers sought them out. He also examined Civil War records and found that a ford that General Sherman had used to cross the Alcovy in 1864, just to the south of where the Alcovy Conservation Center sits today, had now, by the 1970s, a swamp a half a mile wide there. All right. In other words, Trimble's research raised serious questions about whether the Alcovy River swamps, which environmentalists had come to prize, had even existed before the late 19th century. Right. The historical records that Trimble consulted for the years after the Civil War betrayed growing effects of soil erosion and sedimentation. An 1882 water power survey did not even mention any swamps along the Alcovy, though it rued the sluggishness of the river, which was likely a sign of streambed aggradation. An 1891 USGS topo map indicated swampy conditions developing in the lower reaches of the watershed. And a 1901 soil survey noted, quote unquote, meadowland subject to flooding along the Alcovy, even though much of the river's bottomland was still being cultivated. By the mid-1930s, a USDA erosion survey concluded, quote, practically all of the bottomland along the Alcovy River has been covered by sand, or the channel has become so clogged with sand that the bottomlands are now swamps, end quote. The survey estimated that the upland areas around the Alcovy had lost an average of 6 inches of soil during a century of agricultural use, a figure that was consistent with Trimble's later Piedmont estimates. And this is actually a map in my book adapted from Stanley Trimble's work. And basically the darker, the more soil. So more than 9.6 inches is the darkest points. All right. Trimble thus argued, despite their apparent naturalness, that the Alcovy River swamps were of recent anthropogenic origin, artifacts of a century of upland erosion. Quote, the flora and fauna of these swamps have developed to the point that the swamps are now mistakenly considered to be natural and to be thousands of years old, end quote. Now, ultimately, the SCS backed away from most of the channelization efforts in this region, saving the Alcovy Conservation Center Tupelo Gum Swamp and many of the other river's swamplands, sparing them from the effects of channelization. And their provenance largely remains unresolved, although I'm squarely on the side of their recent origin. Wharton's latter-day supporters often use ecological arguments to support their case for the deep temporal origins of these swamps. A lot of the species found there are coastal plain species, and so people speculate that they're relic species from a time deep in the past. Others following Trimble and his considerable historical evidence insist that these swamps are human artifacts. In the late 1990s, the pioneering ecosystem ecologist Eugene Odom, a former colleague of mine at the University of Georgia, tellingly opined of the swamps, quote, those fertile wetlands are the result of our upland folly. We don't know how old the trees are, maybe 100 years old. That's the time at the beginning of the century when we destroyed our soil, end quote. Now, while it would be satisfying to know the truth about these swamps, I'm more interested in 2 other lessons about them. The first is that I think we ought to move beyond the moral authority of a nature before history to advance environmental arguments, because of course that's what's at stake here. That's why even the folks at the Georgia Wildlife Federation are reluctant to admit that these swamps are any less than thousands of years old. The Alcovy swamps are almost certainly artifacts of nature and culture, of human and non-human forces intertwined and acting across time. Surely the Tupelo Gum Swamp is in many ways a natural place. Nobody planted it or populated it with wildlife. The soils and the hydrology may be artifacts of past human land abuse, but the forested habitat that exists there today is otherwise marginally or minimally influenced by human action or intent, except perhaps by enlightened human restraint. So why does it matter from a conservation standpoint then, if these swamps are hundreds of years old, 100 years old, or thousands of years old? If they're havens for wildlife, safe harbors for rare species, providers of an array of ecosystem services, and recreational refuges, isn't that enough? Now, by raising these questions, I don't mean to suggest that time and human influence are unimportant to assessing conservation value. To the contrary, I think they're very important. I think they're critical. But I also think that breaking down the stark nature-culture divide that sits behind so much of our environmentalist claims would actually allow us to develop better, more robust conservation criteria that deal with time and human influence in more satisfying ways. Preservationists may have to give up the easy normative linkage between the is of deep temporal naturalness and the ought of preservation advocacy. But there's much to be gained in seeing places like this as valuable, though novel, ecosystems influenced by, though not wholly derivative of, human land use. Moreover, by acknowledging the likely history of anthropogenic erosion in the creation of these swamps, it better connects their laudable protection to the less than laudable land use histories that surrounded them. All right? It allows us to sidestep some of the mental habits that the environmental historian William Cronin famously indicted as the trouble with wilderness. Rather than creating parks and conservation areas that separate nature from history, here's a remarkable opportunity for interpretation that brings them together to, in Cronin's phrasing again, save nature in time. All right? The Alcovy River swamps deserve such an interpretation, like Providence Canyon, and this is one of the big arguments of my book. They deserve to be famous as a new kind of park. Now, the Alcovy River swamps also embody another important lesson, and that is this. The long history of human-induced soil erosion in the South has faded from view since World War II. As a result, in equal parts of ecological processes, changing land use regimes, and shifting environmental politics and priorities. In the interwar years, the South's agricultural landscapes were festering with open wounds, pockmarked with scars, and the region's major challenge was reforming a land-killing agriculture and the deep social and racial inequities that came with it. If any one phrase captured the New Deal environmental critique, it was this mantra from this famous Père Lorentz film called The River, in which the narrator says, "Poor lands make poor people, and poor people make poor lands." In many ways, that was the environmental critique at the heart of the New Deal. But since World War II, as huge numbers of people have moved off the land and as environmental concerns took on a more urban and suburban sensibility, it's gotten easier by the year not to see the history of erosion in the landscapes of the former plantation South, and thus to forget this history. That so many by the 1960s and 1970s were convinced of the naturalness of the Alcovy River swamps, when only a few decades earlier, the soil survey had clearly suggested that they were anthropogenic, is powerful evidence of how quickly landscapes can change and human memories about them can fade. This is the ecology of erasure. So let's move to the east, to a second place I want to tell you a little bit about. A site just to the south of Athens, Georgia, where I lived for the better part of a decade. A slightly different example of these dynamics. One of the most remarkable places to encounter the history of soil erosion and floodplain sedimentation is a place called Skull Shoals, an abandoned mill town on the Oconee River. It's an old picture of it from the 1870s or the 1880s. Settlers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans and their slaves, settled the area that became Skull Shoals in the 1780s. In 1786, the Georgia legislature created a new county named after General Nathaniel Greene, a Revolutionary War hero, called Greene County. That same year, in 1793, when the county was created, that same year, Eli Whitney perfected the cotton gin, all right? Interestingly enough, he perfected it on this plantation outside of Savannah that was owned by Nathaniel Greene, but it was an invention that had a transformative impact, or contributed to the transformative impact that would occur when short staple cotton moved across the Piedmont and into other parts of the South. The shoals, or rocky falls, that gave Skull Shoals its name were attractive for mill development. But by the end of the first decade of the 19th century, there was a grist mill and a cotton gin on the site. And by 1834, there was actually a major cotton mill. All right. By the late antebellum period, there was such a substantial manufacturing complex on the site that hundreds of workers were employed. And there was a dam and a race system, and something like 200 spindles were animated by this water power. By the eve of the Civil War, then, Skull Shoals was a vital industrial enclave into which cotton flowed from the surrounding region. But cotton was not the only thing flowing into Skull Shoals in the 19th century. While the community survived the Civil War and the ravages of Sherman's march, a quieter invasion was contributing to its demise. In the years before the war, as planters and slaves cleared more of the watershed for cotton and corn, which was also highly erosive, sediment filled the Oconee tributaries and then the Oconee River itself, such that by 1851, a local judge, Garnett Andrews of Greene County, warned area farmers and planters about the, quote, fearful deterioration of our soil, end quote. And I'm quoting him here again. These bleak hills with their gullied mouths speak more eloquently and convincingly on the subject than I can. The land was already in bad shape, in other words. Sediment soon buried the shoals and then built up behind a 10-foot-high mill dam that had subsequently been built atop the shoals. After the Civil War, as Southerners remade the cotton economy with nominally free labor, soil erosion increased in severity, further aggrading the river channel. A disastrous flood in 1887 swamped the entire community and undid what remained of the manufacturing operation. And an 1889 report by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said that the flood had been exacerbated and that the mill had in fact failed due to silting of the river below the dam. The Skull Shoals community then limped into the 20th century, and some of the early 20th century residents remember the dam, this 10-foot-high dam, as a small waterfall. But they soon left, all right? Today, Skull Shoals is a ruins. And when one first visits Skull Shoals, several features on the site stand out. First, and there's another picture, if you walk just a little bit away from the site, you see plenty of these. Deep gullies filled with old field pines. One can also see other remains, including this stone piers from the mill building. But if you look at the river, there's absolutely no sign of the shoals, the falls that initially were why the settlement was put there, or even of the dam. All right, both of them are gone. The muddy Oconee River flows by lazily. Now, in the 1990s, a landscape architect by the name of Bruce Ferguson, working at the University of Georgia, did a study of this site, and he soon realized that the whole area had been inundated with sediment to an unimaginable degree, much more than previously appreciated. He came to suspect that that dam across the river was probably still there, below the river, all right? And he and his team conducted subsurface magnetic and radar surveys, LIDAR, and they discovered strong evidence that their hunch was correct, including what appeared to be several feet below the ground, an old metal turbine that had probably been part of the mill structure. In fact, they postulated that this was, in fact, the second floor of the mill building. Okay? Based on all that evidence, Ferguson estimated the Cotton Era sediment was as much as 14 feet deep on the downstream side of the buried dam and shoals, and he posited that the visible remains of the mill building were in fact its second story. I've already told you that. So what happened at Skull Shoals and along the Alcovy River happened throughout the region. Massive erosion led to heavy sedimentation that raised riverbeds, filled reservoirs and buried mill dams, transformed river and stream ecosystems, and buried rich alluvial lands beneath feet of coarse sediment. And for complex reasons, which I can explain to you in a half-satisfying way if you want, all of this led to a lot of swamping of land nearby, okay? Dan, actually, Richter took me to this site in the Sumter forest, and we went down into this river bottom, and we just sort of both looked at each other, and it was so obvious that this river used to be, way down below. All right. Tellingly, Stanley Trimble came to his dissertation on southern soil erosion on the Piedmont only after having thought about doing a dissertation on the geography of mills in the 19th century Piedmont. But when he went and started looking for these mill sites, he couldn't find them. He became confused, quote, when many sites turned out to be swampy morasses rather than the dams and associated installations I had expected, end quote. So you can imagine why he became suspicious of the Alcovy River swamps. All right. So there's one final perplexing quality of Skull Shoals, which I want to use as sort of a segue to the second part of my talk. Today, those ruins exist within the Oconee National Forest. All right. What are the ruins of the most important early industrial development in central Georgia during the 19th century doing in a national forest? All right. The answer to that question leads me to a set of lessons about the coming of conservation to the South and the relationship, or its relation to Clark's greening of the South. All right. Clark famously wrote in the 1980s, quote, for broad sweeps of the South, the ancient Red Hill badge of shame, a great phrase for Gullies, so harshly condemned only a half century ago by Big Hugh Bennett, has now been tucked gracefully beneath a blessed tree cover, end quote. So over the last century, the South has seen an explosion of green as forests have returned to and reshaped huge swaths of denuded territory. And the South states and national parks and forests are today mostly the products of those processes. And almost all of them have histories of human land use hidden beneath their blessed tree cover. That's perhaps not a surprise. What is maybe a little bit surprising is that a significant number of these southern landscapes of conservation exist today where there was once some of the most extreme soil erosion in the United States. And so to understand this, I think we need to take a quick tour through another of the South's great environmental traumas during this period. From roughly 1880 to 1920, even as tenant farmers produced the region's most destructive pulse of soil erosion, the timber industry came to the South with a vengeance, cutting more than 150 million acres of forest. They cut extensively across the longleaf pine belt of the coastal plain. They cut extensively in southern Appalachia, its great hardwood reserves, and they cut out the remaining hardwood bottomland forests whose wet intractability had protected them from human transformation up until this point. So as cotton culture was digging its nails deeper into the plantation crescent and its thinning soils and hanging on for dear life at this time, the plantation South's forested fringes were coming crashing down. It was a rough time to be concerned about the environment if you lived in the South. And by the 1920s, the South's forest lands were in as sorry shape as its farmlands. And this terrible conjuncture brought conservation into the region. Now, the South's land crisis and the conservation responses to it varied by subregion. The industrial cutting of forests in southern Appalachia, as I learned how to say it when I lived in Georgia, heightened conservationist desires to create national forests and national parks, even if that meant displacing people. So under the Weeks Act of 1911, the federal government purchased large areas in the mountainous South and created these Appalachian national forests that many of us are familiar with. And then by the late 1920s and 1930s, there were movements to create Shenandoah and Great Smoky Mountain national parks, also often from cut-over land. Okay? Southern Appalachian landscapes of conservation thus grew from the ashes of environmental transformation. And they often contain deep human histories and enduring land use legacies. This is something we know pretty well. Now, as industrial timber cutting waned in the 1920s and 1930s, there was a different conversation about what to do with the cut-over pine lands of the coastal plain. Something like 79 to 90 million acres of the southern coastal plain had once been longleaf pine woodlands. They'd long been fire maintained. Their understories had incredible diversity. But the desires of the timber industry and foresters to quickly reforest these lands led to fire exclusion. And while there were some national forests created on these cut-over portions of the coastal plain, conservation also came to this part of the South in the guise of fire suppression, as foresters favored replacement species like slash and loblolly pine, which don't tolerate fire well at the seedling stage. Forestry interests favored these species because they were excellent colonizers of degraded land and quickly grew up in thick stands, even in the absence of replanting. I was in the Duke Forest today, and I nearly snapped an even better photo illustrating this of these loblolly pines coming up in thickets, all right? The generative power of these old field pines quickly transformed lamentations about southern forest destruction into booster visions of a forested future in the South. Now, while some agriculture did migrate to the coastal plain and become more intense and modern after World War II, much of the rest of that region was converted to plantation pine production. And in another remarkable conjuncture in Southern environmental history, a serendipitous new industry, the pulp and paper industry, came to covet what became known as the second forest. All right. One of the biggest boosters of this transformation, and this is a little local color for you all, was a man named Jonathan Daniels, the longtime editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, and son of the paper's founder, the infamous Josephus Daniels. In his 1937 book, A Southerner Discovers the South, Jonathan Daniels had actually made a famous visit to Providence Canyon. One of the joys of writing about Providence Canyon was it turns out all these people had written about it themselves. And his was among the best pieces. He called these really dramatic formations in Providence Canyon that you saw some of in one of my early slides. He described them as, quote, fine phallic symbols in an advancing sterility. I mean, isn't that good? That should have been the title of my book. And really his visit of my book functions as a pivotal moment. But after visiting Providence Canyon, and then he went to the Andersonville site, the Civil War prison, he headed to Savannah and to the laboratory of Dr. Charles Hurdy. Here pictured in this slide right there, I think. By the early 1930s, Hurdy's laboratory had solved the technical problems associated with transforming high-resin southern pines into white paper for newsprint. And Hurdy himself had become a tireless booster of the pulp and paper industry as the key for realizing the long-deferred dream of a new South. This was a development of great interest to Southern newspapermen like Jonathan Daniels. Hurdy was also famous for developing this really innovative cup and gutter system that helped the naval stores industry become much more efficient without killing the trees. And most importantly, to the residents of the state of Georgia, he founded UGA football. All right. And then actually left Georgia and eventually taught at UNC. So for the pulp and paper industry to really take off in the South, it would need a large, consistent, and proximate supply of pulpable timber. After World War II, the second forest regenerating all over the region inspired a concerted effort to feed the insatiable demand of this industry. And in 1957, exactly 20 years after his initial journey through the South, Jonathan Daniels made another journey through the South, this time to see how pulp and paper had transformed the region. He wrote another short book titled The Forest is Our Future, or Is the Future. I think it was actually published by International Paper. And Daniels found that the industry had grown, quote, almost as quickly as the loblolly pine. By the mid-1950s, forest products were worth more than agricultural products in the South. Right. And a big parade, as he called it, of paper companies had come into the region, buying up millions of acres for short rotation pine production. You probably know pulp and paper doesn't require trees to grow to the kind of commercial maturity that the lumber market does. But tellingly, Daniels noted that the majority of forest production was occurring, in fact, on private land in the South, much of it former land converted to forestry. So let's look at that story. The pulp and paper industry and the generative powers of oldfield pines were not the only forces contributing to this greening trend. Federal policy was also really critical. The Clark-McNary Act of 1924, one of those forest acts that I never really knew what it was about, but a really important one, and perhaps it was about cooperative fire control, but most importantly, it gave the Forest Service the capacity to buy private lands without the Weeks Act's provision that it has to be protecting watersheds. All right. It gave the federal government power to buy land for forests, national forests. During the New Deal, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, as you probably well know, paid farmers to take land out of production. And a lot of that land in the South was poor, eroded land that went into forests. And as a result, a lot of tenants were put off the land. So trees in, tenants out. All right. The Civilian Conservation Corps and the Soil Conservation Service also made tree planting and kudzu planting one of their chief activities, much of it on lands taken out of farming. And then when the Supreme Court declared the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act of 1936 made soil conservation, in fact, the major constitutional justification for removing marginal lands from production. And then after World War II, something called the Soil Bank Act of 1956 provided even more powerful incentives for private landowners to shift from crop production to forestry. Under that program, farmers who put their land in trees were reimbursed 80% of the planting costs and then were paid an annual payment for 10 years. So ostensibly a conservation program, it was also a program that allowed a lot of Southern landowners to effectively convert from producing crops to producing timber with these payments that allowed them to wait out the time it took their trees to grow, at least towards commercial maturity. And as a result, millions of acres of former cropland in the South, much of it in this eroded plantation crescent, and I use that phrase because if you look at where tobacco and cotton was grown, it's sort of in this crescent shape throughout the South. Texas kind of screws it all up, but don't they always? It all went into forest precisely when huge numbers of tenants were leaving the land. Thus did the South's agricultural past come to be hidden beneath a mantle of trees. And as this happened, the federal government began, and state governments, to create a slew of new conservation areas. And I've sort of zoomed in on a Forest Service map here, and you see some of it. All right. The region's national forests from the 1930s and after, many of them within the Piedmont and Coastal Plain and other plantation districts, are a case in point here. Now, some of them, like the Francis Marion National Forest, which is right down there, mostly cutover land, although what's fascinating about the Francis Marion is you can still go in there and find old rice embankments and rice fields, but that was ancient history at this point. But a more intriguing suite of national forests developed between 1930 and 1960 across the former Cotton Kingdom. And I'm really thinking about these ones through here. I don't have great mouse control, but you get it. The national forest came into being not to protect mountainous watersheds or to reforest cutover lands in non-farm regions. Rather, these forests sprang up precisely where human-induced soil erosion had been the most acute, and in some cases where the New Deal state had tried to intervene in its most creative ways to fix the problem. These national forests then are grave markers of a sort, subtle memorials to both a land-killing past and innovative efforts to reform it. Let's visit a couple. The Sumter National Forest in Upcountry, South Carolina. And let me see, these two units right there is a prime example of this phenomenon, for it contains what were some of the most eroded lands in the former Cotton Belt. This is a great picture that Dan helped me get. The early forester going, what the hell are we going to do with this? And it included portions of both Fairfield and Union counties in South Carolina. And these were counties that Hugh Hammond Bennett had written extensively about. And so some of these places I'm showing you, I pull through my whole book in terms of, the first soil surveyors would go to these places and go, oh my God, what happened here? It looks like a moonscape, all right? Well, Fairfield County was one of Bennett's favorite examples, along with Stewart County, where Providence Canyon was, all right? Federal purchase of lands within two discrete areas of the South Carolina Piedmont began in 1934 during the early New Deal years, enabled by the purchase provisions of that Clark-McNary Act. And then President Roosevelt established the Sumter National Forest in 1936. Most of the land was marginal or submarginal cotton land. Some of it was classified as cutover land, but most of that cutover land had previously been agricultural land, but had grown up in trees. And actually, there's a whole history of southern farming being extensive, really extensive and itinerant and shifting. So a huge percentage of the southern agricultural landscape was almost always in trees. All right. And much of the land was badly gullied. In 1947, the Sumter became home to the Calhoun Experimental Forest, created as a site for studying, quote, forest stabilization of eroding agricultural soils and for the management of secondary southern pine forests, end quote. And as one of its early publications noted, the site was, quote, was chosen because it represented the poorest Piedmont conditions, end quote. And it certainly did. Since 1957, the site has also been, as many of you may know, the site of a long-term ecosystem study now known as the Calhoun Critical Zone Observatory. And so the Sumter National Forest, and the Calhoun in particular, is not only a reforested conservation area built atop some of the worst eroded soils in the South, but has also become the home for and hosts an important ecological research study of the dynamics of that very transformation. And like the Sumter, a number of other national forests in the South had similar origins, coming right out of the New Deal and land purchase, particularly a couple in Mississippi, including the Homachito, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and the Holly Springs. Very similar histories there. Homachito in the Natchez district, these Luss Hills of Mississippi that are highly erosive. Now, even more telling of this dynamic are several other southern national forests that took a more circuitous route to national forest designation. They grew up from New Deal land utilization projects, as they were called, ambitious efforts to re-engineer rural economies and land use through democratic planning in areas where poverty, racial inequality, and environmental degradation had walked hand in hand. And many of these had their roots in a study by the National Resources Board that had recommended that the federal government purchase 75 million acres of submarginal farmland, much of it highly eroded during the depths of the Depression. All right, and that report included something called the Reconnaissance Erosion Survey of the United States, which was the first comprehensive effort to map soil erosion. And this is a beautiful map. I actually went to my library and I stole the folded copy, temporarily. And I went to Kinko's and I had them make me this big, beautiful copy, and then I went and put it back. So I guess I'm live on YouTube, so now I'm busted. Okay. And so this mapped erosion, and I'll give you a slightly more close-up thing. And so the red is a category known as destroyed by gullying. And if you look, this is Providence Canyon area, Stewart County. That's Fairfield and Union. That's Sumter. And this is another part of the Sumter. I think this is probably part of the Sumter, but I also speculate it might be another place. Does anyone have a guess what that might be? What? Savannah River Plan. So part of the hunch here is that the most highly eroded land gets put into these federal land uses. And the Savannah River Lab, of course, becomes a really important site for ecological research, particularly old-field succession studies in the South. All right, I got to start moving here. So this land utilization project, they wanted to buy 75 million acres. It ended up being a much more modest thing, but it still included something like 250 projects, more than 11 million acres of land purchased between 1933 and 1946. And the Northern Plains saw most of it, and actually the conservation designation that comes out of that are national grasslands, all of them bought up as part of this program. But the South ranked second in purchased acreage, and in many parts of the South, national forests and other conservation areas are all that remain of what were in fact ambitious land planning projects, trying to readjust people who were farming the land to the realities of the land that they were farming. All right, so let me give you a couple quick examples. America's smallest national forest is the Tuskegee National Forest, which you can't even see really on there, but it's basically somewhere right in there, I think. Now, obviously, Tuskegee is famous for Tuskegee University, formerly the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black university founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881. And from the Institute's inception, its teachers and others like George Washington Carver were desperately trying to get local farmers to farm in ways that were less destructive of the soil. But by the 1930s, despite a rise in African American land ownership and Tuskegee's best efforts, large parts of the county's land base were badly eroded. There's a picture. These conditions and the presence of the Tuskegee Institute made the area an attractive one for New Deal land utilization project, initially with the AAA and Tuskegee, and then later in something called the Tuskegee Planned Land Use Demonstration, which began in 1934. I'm going to race through this quickly, but it was a very ambitious effort run by African Americans to try to reform farming in Macon County, one of the worst eroded counties in the South. And really all that's left of it, of this effort, is a national forest, about 10,000 acres, all right? And I think that's important, all right? Let me skip to the other example we used, Georgia's Oconee National Forest, home to Shoals, which I was telling you about, which also came into being. And in fact, so Tuskegee, what happened was it was this land use demonstration project, and then it became a Soil Conservation Service project, and only in 1959 did it become a national forest. And the same thing happened with the Oconee, all right? The Oconee Forest was pieced together from lands purchased by two of Georgia's largest Piedmont land use projects, the Plantation Piedmont Project, which included lands in Putnam, Jasper, and Jones counties to the north of Macon, the Briar Patch country that Joel Chandler Harris made famous in his Uncle Remus stories, and the North Central Georgia Project, which focused on Greene County. This, obviously, whenever you talk about the New Deal, things get a little thick in terms of acronyms and things, so bear with me, all right? In 1934, the USDA opened an office in Eatonton, Georgia, with the aim of buying up thousands of acres, and they did so quite quickly. And they noticed not only tremendous erosion from agriculture, but also farmers were so desperately poor that they were now just cutting their timber as well for whatever money they could make for it. Forest resources had been heavily exploited since 1920, and erosion was almost as active in the woodlands as in the open fields, a report said. So in Greene County, you get something called the North Central Georgia Land Use Project, which fed into a larger late New Deal project called the Unified Farm Program, an effort that the rural sociologist Arthur Raper, pictured here in the 1924 edition of the Yakety Yak, the UNC yearbook. He studied with Howard Odom at UNC, made famous in many of his studies of tenantry, including this book, Tenants of the Almighty. This project was initiated in 1939 and was a demonstration project that used local committees to coordinate the work of all of the various New Deal programs in this county. Really, Raper made Greene County the apotheosis of Southern tenantry. And part of that effort was land use planning. They quickly put a map of the county together, determined which areas should continue in cultivation, which areas should be in pasture, which areas should be in forest. They determined that 80% of the county's acreage required intensive erosion control. The federal government brought one of its African-American CCC camps into the county. And they also did things like kind of old-fashioned home ec stuff, canning, and getting people to just have more diverse diets. And this, by the way, is a Jack Delano photo on your right. It's actually one of the few of those 1930s and 40s era photos that are actually in color. So that's an original color, one of the earliest color photos that shows the extent of the gullying in the county. The Unified Farm Program, then, was the New Deal at its most idealistic, trying to get this southern county that had been ground down by this system of tenant agriculture that found tenants locked in this vicious cycle of poverty and degrading soils, and it tried to reform it. And they also purchased about 30,000 acres next to the Oconee River, retired it from agricultural production, and it became the Oconee National Forest. That's the land that dumped all of its soil down into Shoals, and that's why Shoals is today within a national forest. Now, the Oconee National Forest is only the most prominent conservation legacy of these Piedmont, Georgia land use projects. Adjoining the national forest in Jasper, and Jones counties, and let's see if I can go back to that map. There are actually two units on the Oconee, and these are Jasper Jones, and that's green up there. Adjoining the lower one is something called the Piedmont National Wildlife Refuge, a 35,000 acre wildlife refuge created by President Roosevelt in 1939 using these land use planting lands. And it's now mature loblolly pine. They have red cockaded woodpeckers and all sorts of stuff there. And a third Georgia Piedmont land utilization project is now something called Hard Labor Creek State Park, which was developed by the CCC and which is also a park that you can walk through today and find all sorts of erosion, relics of it with a discerning eye. And these examples have analogs, again, throughout the former plantation South, where national forests, state parks, national wildlife refuges, and other landscapes of conservation emerged from land utilization projects, direct federal land purchase, various other land planning programs, or sometimes, as in the case of the Alcovy River, just the power of nature to reform or remake degraded landscapes into places worth saving. And as these examples suggest, it's not been unusual in the South for an area with an extreme erosion history to become a national forest or state park or to be protected by other conservation designations. In fact, I would argue it's closer to the rule. And in my book, I use that to say, well, you all laughed at the beginning when you heard that Providence Canyon State Park is this massive anthropogenic erosion gully. But in fact, if you just look at a map of conservation areas in the South, many of those areas have similar provenance. The Providence Canyon is the only place where they actually celebrate the scenic results of it. All right. So what are the big lessons? Let me conclude quickly here. I'll offer a few, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. The first is perhaps simply that we need to know more about this remarkable history of southern soil erosion, a topic that even with the explosive growth of environmental history as a field has been surprisingly neglected by my colleagues and I, in part because perhaps this explosive growth of vegetation in the post-war South has obscured it from view. I think there's some other reasons for this neglect, which I'm happy to talk about. Soil erosion transformed southern landscapes and waterways in profound and long-lasting ways, and it was arguably the nation's #1 environmental problem during the New Deal years, and yet it has been all too easy to miss that erosive history in the landscapes that have come to seem so natural that have developed in its wake. The Ecology of Erasure thus speaks to an interesting set of tensions between environmental restoration and what we might consider a form of historic preservation. Second, many of these areas were places where people lived. They loved, they worked hard, and they often suffered. They were places where the South's environmental history met some of the most painful aspects of its human history. And they were sometimes even places where innovative planning efforts attempted to solve those wedded human and environmental problems, where reformers tried to break that vicious cycle between poor lands and poor people. And as we celebrate the rewilding of these places, I think we need to acknowledge the importance of their human histories as well. If we don't, I think we risk excluding important voices from this history and miss the ways in which pervasive reforestation of the region has been a struggle for some. Stewart County, where Providence Canyon is, now looks like that. It's now more than 90% forested. It used to be one of the highest cotton-producing counties in the South. And the former city county manager, who became an important friend and an informant on this project, once said to me, "Sometimes I feel imprisoned by trees." Right? And he was really speaking to an entire county which is disproportionately African-American, exceptionally poor, has very little. I think they were excited because they recently got an immigration prison there. It's a poor place. And these trees, for many folks there, are symbols of poverty, almost. That might be putting it a little strongly. This is a different take on the greening of the South, but it speaks powerfully to the social dimensions of the ecology of erasure. Finally, on a brighter note, to the extent that we might find places to read and interpret this remarkable history of human-induced soil erosion and keep it in mind in a greener South, we have the serendipity that many of the best areas for doing so are already protected by conservation designations of various sorts, ready for our efforts to reinterpret them. All right. And my hunch is that these areas are more ubiquitous than we know. In fact, in my book's acknowledgments, I begin by thanking two areas that were really critical to me and my family as I was raising two boys. One, a place called the Ivy Creek Natural Area in Charlottesville, Virginia, and another called the Sandy Creek Nature Center in Athens, Georgia. Well, it turns out the Ivy Creek Natural Area used to be a farm that was owned by the African-American demonstration agent in Albemarle County, and then had resorted to forests, and actually became a real controversy in the 1970s when real estate developers wanted to develop it, and they protected it as open space. But it's got this fascinating African-American farming history, and it's also got some pretty good gullies on the land. It's now actually recognized, and I think it's something called like the Virginia African-American Heritage Trail. It's a site there. So I think they've actually done a good job recognizing the combined environmental and human history. And the Sandy Creek Nature Center, turns out, was within the larger Sandy Creek watershed, which was one of the first soil erosion, under the Soil Erosion Service, demonstration projects in the country. It was one of the most eroded landscapes in the South. So these two little places that I end up like hiking on the weekends with my friends in the South turn out to have really fascinating histories connected to them. All right. They stand in relation to those towns, Athens and Charlottesville, as the Duke Forest stands in relation to this area. And the Duke Forest, as I saw this morning with Dan, also has some pretty good gullies on it as well. I initially retreated to these places because they seemed like natural islands in a sea of growing residential and commercial sprawl. But soon, as I learned to read the past in these landscapes, they became another sort of archive to me, filled with evidence of the Southern past. Like the Duke Forest, these are places to build and exercise both historical and environmental literacy, to pursue interdisciplinary research across the humanities sciences divide, to include and speak to diverse local constituencies. In short, to do a different kind of forest history that doesn't miss poignant human history for the trees. Thank you very much.